Hello YouTube, this is Matt Pullen, and today we are going to talk about the Owen's defense, which is defined by e4, b6. And originally I was going to make this video about the specific line d4, bishop b7, bishop d3, f5, which is a very tactical try with the idea of exploiting the pin on the long diagonal and the unprotected g2 pawn. So I was going to talk about how to refute this for white. There are a couple different refutations, and you can find most of that information on the Wikipedia article on Owen's defense. But I wanted to put an explanation in there in terms of why white would choose to play the bishop to d3, creating that undefended pawn, as opposed to, say, putting the knight on c3 to guard the pawn instead. After all, isn't the general principle knights before bishops? And there is an answer to that. Bishop to d3, white is going for a formation with the queen on e2, knight on f3, pawns on c3 and a3, leaving this knight on its home square and castling. So I was going to discuss that as well, but in discussing why that plan is good, you need to consider what happens in the main lines, after bringing the knight out to c3 instead, and why the line with the pawn on c3 is an improvement. But I was looking at these, and I was discovering some pretty deep things about the knight c3 lines in the Owens. I don't play the Owens. I had a high school teammate who played the Owens for black, but I don't know a whole lot about it. And I've found these lines were interesting. Some of them contain themes that you can see in like the French or the Alekhines lines. But there's always going to be a twist, with the early bishop on b7, which black is hoping to emphasize. So after knight c3. I'm just going to show you some lines in this knight c3 variation of the Owens. So e6, and the idea is that since white has shown that the knight is going to be on c3, one idea for black is to play the bishop to b4, pinning the knight on c3, after which the pawn on e4 can be attacked. And one of the lines, and the line that I used to play against the Owens is 4a3, just a prophylactic move to keep the b4 square away from the black bishop and keep the pawn guarded. There's also just bishop d3, simply developing a piece, and there are some other moves as well. But let's talk about a3 first, because this is a pretty interesting variation actually. Black, the most consistent move is to play knight f6, developing another piece and putting pressure on e4. If black, after a3, if black plays d5 instead, striking in the center with his pawn, then white, I think, should exchange. E takes d5. And now, if black doesn't want to just give his bishop pair away for nothing, he's got to play e takes d5, and now bishop f4, because if black wants to put the bishop on d6, then white will exchange. So here, I think because there's a very good chance that the pawn on d5 will remain blockaded, is difficult to see how the bishop on b7 is going to play a role. White is just going to play this like probably something like bishop d3, f3, to keep knights off of e4, and then queen d2 and castles, or maybe just continue with like knight f3, bishop e2, castles. And in either way, the bishop on b7 doesn't make a whole lot of sense in this particular exchanged French line. So that's why knight f6 is best, is more flexible, because black is not committed the pawn to d5, and the bishop, the long diagonal is still open. So after knight f6, there's bishop d3 is the most obvious move to defend the pawn. And now black plays d5. Well, he can play c5, but d5 I think is more to the point. He wants to try to show that this move a3 by white does not doesn't contribute to the center battle over the e4 square. So let's look at a couple different lines here. After e takes d5, say white exchanges, now black can play knight takes. And this is very comfortable for black, I would think, because the bishop diagonal is kept open. So the bishop on b7 in this small center line is potentially a very strong piece. Black could just develop like, I don't know, knight d7, and bishop e7 castles, something like this. And then maybe later play pawn to c5. So you'd think that white would play, pawn to e5, because if he just defends on e4, then there might be a lot of exchanges in the center. So pawn to e5, and here, I mean, is consistent with the French defense, to bring the f knight back to d7, with the idea of simply going after the white center with c5, knight c6, etc. So there are a couple different ways that white could approach this. He could put the pawn on f4 with the idea of using d4 for his pieces. After, say, c5, knight f3, c takes d, knight b5, with the idea of capturing with the b knight on d4, and keeping the d4 square for pieces, blockading the black pawn on d5, as opposed to having a white pawn on d4. And also note the pawn on a3 is preventing black from playing bishop check in this variation. So there's also, if white wants to play for the big pawn center, he can play knight ce2, and then meet c5 with c3, and knight c6 with f4. And this is reminiscent of some of the big pawn center lines in the Steinitz French, where white will bring the g knight to f3 and just play to maintain the central phalanx here. So I think is more consistent with the Owen's strategy of putting the bishop on b7 early. Whereas in the French defense is not clear that b7 is such a great square for this bishop. But if black were to play knight e4, well, then any kind of a capture on e4, black would capture back with the d pawn, and the influence of this bishop on b7 will be increased. And also the d file will be open, so black can assault white's pawn center by playing something like c5. So knight ce2, I don't know, I didn't enter any lines with capturing on e4, but I don't know, if knight takes e4, then just d takes, and then the bishop on d3 will have to move, so black will be gaining a tempo. And if I don't know, bishop takes and pawn takes, you can see it is not easy to clean up this this pawn on e4, which is kind of separated from the rest of black's forces. But if white tries to attack this pawn, then black will respond by attacking the the white pawn on d4. So is a very active game, even if this pawn on e4 is lost, the bishop on b7, which is now unopposed, will have a lot of influence. There's no white bishop on the light squares. And then I don't know, something like this, and then white does have a bishop on the light squares, but black is gaining a tempo here. So this this type of game probably probably white should do something else as opposed to taking. So he plans to attack the knight on e4. This move knight c to e2, moving the knight that could be exchanged away from the reach of the knight on e4, just depriving the knight on e4 of any targets, before trying to trap it with pawns. So there's a line in the in the Alekins where after knight c3, d5, e5, knight e4, where white plays knight c to e2 with the idea of preventing black from exchanging on c3. And he's threatening to gain tempo on the knight on e4, either by playing pawn to d3 or pawn to f3. And it's hard to see how this knight is going to get back to a safe square. So usually black plays f6 with the idea of bringing the knight to, back to f7. But here is a little different. Like after f6, with the idea of coming to f7, seems like a good idea, but there's no bishop guarding e6 in this variation. After knight f4, black is probably losing because white is threatening to chop on e6, and also queen h5 comes into the position. So, the plan for white is to play f3, and then the knight will have to go back to g5, and then h4 will trap the knight. So one idea is to play h6 here. The idea, instead of freeing up f7 for the knight, black wants to free up h7 for the knight. So this line, if white tries to attack the knight here, it might go f3, knight g5, h4, knight h7. And now, can white really get an advantage in this position? So after f4, which frees up his knight to develop, c5, c3, knight c6. It looks like a reasonable, French type position for black. The black king is not really in any danger because it could always, crawl over to the queen side. Black would like to, blockade this, the white pawns on the king side by playing something like, g6 and h5, but he has to be patient. Otherwise, white will have the opportunity for some kind of a pawn sacrifice, opening the lines over there. He could also just try and totally close down the position by playing, the pawn to c4, and then something like, queen d7 and castles. But it seems like a reasonable defense for black. If this knight can later, come back to, to f8, where it guards the e6 and g6 squares, it won't be completely out of play. So white does need to look for opportunities to play pawn sacrifices like f5, or maybe in some positions h5, to try and open up the position before black can get to safety. So another idea aside from h6 is to play c5. This is considerably more aggressive. There's no, he doesn't defend against the idea of white trapping the black knight with f3 and h4, but he creates a counter threat, which is c4, trapping the bishop on d3. For instance, should white play f3, then black can just put the knight on d6. This is a very strong move, because if white were to capture, then black plays c4, and the bishop on d3 has no squares. Oops, I did not want to do that. Yeah. How do I make yellow? Oh, there we go. So all these squares are protected. So, so like c3 instead to give the bishop a place to drop back, and then black can just put the knight on f5, and black is probably fine here. So it is more critical in this position after c5 to play bishop b5 check, trading off the bishop, which is going to get trapped on d3, in order to win the knight with f3. So here black is forced to play bishop to c6, otherwise he's losing a piece for very little compensation. So after bishop takes, knight takes, there's f3 going after the knight, because otherwise black might, if white does not play f3, black might capture on c5, and this gives the knight a place to go back on c5 d7. So f3, and then if black were to bring the knight to g5, it would be trapped with h4. So instead of doing that, black captures on d4. This threatens to escape the knight to c5, so white must take right away, and now black captures on e4. And white is up a piece for 2 pawns, but the 2 pawns for black look very imposing, and this pawn on e5 is quite weak. Houdini is giving the line c3, d3, queen a4, queen d7, knight g3, attacking this pawn, rook d8, threatening to play d2, check, bishop d2, knight takes e5, queen takes e4, queen b5, threatening to come into the position with queen takes b2, which threatens the rook. So would you castle queenside in this position? Well, I hope not, because after castles queenside, there's bishop takes a3. This threatens mate on b2. And if b takes a3, then queen b3 is forcing mate. So is castling queenside with the pawn on a3 always a bad idea? Well, no, not necessarily. In this Sicilian dragon line, where white delayed the bishop to c4, so black tries to exploit this by trading on exchanging the knight on d4 and then playing the bishop to e6. So something like king b1, queen a5, g8. And now here, in this position, black is clearly threatening to play something like an exchange sack, rook takes c3, followed by queen takes a2. So a3 is actually the best move in this position, because it stops the black queen from attacking a2. And although it does weaken the white pawns on dark squares, because black's bishop is committed to the fianchetto diagonal, is not realistic that it's going to come back and try and sacrifice itself on a3. So this is a specific kind of situation where putting the pawn on a3 is not a bad idea when castle at queenside. But here, that is not the case. There's not enough defensive resources on the queenside for white. So b4, so that was just kind of a blow aside there. b4 defends the b2 pawn in a better way. So then bishop c6, knight f3, f5. And this line is, Houdini is only giving white's advantage at less than half a pawn here. So if this is the best white continuation, to exploit black's sacrifice, then I think it's safe to conclude that this line is very playable for black. He's got a potentially crushing pawn center in and control over some center squares in exchange for his piece. So in conclusion, after knight ce2, knight e4, knight ce2, which is the critical idea in the Alekhine, variation that where black has a knight on e4. Here, black, if he wants to roll the dice, he can play c5, which offers a piece sacrifice, or h6 seems like a reasonable, closed position alternative. So yeah, I mean, what else is there to look at here? So I guess that is I guess that's all for the a3 lines I have here. So there's also bishop d3. Putting the bishop on a square where it could have gone on the previous move, but now white is committed to having a knight on c3. And here, knight f6 is again the most principled move. Bishop to b4 seems a little. It's possible to play this here, but it seems a little committed. There's no threat here because this pawn on e4 is overprotected. And I think it is just better to play knight f6 first because we're pretty sure that the knight is coming to f6, but the bishop might want to go to e7 or stay at home, or play like c5. There are definitely alternatives to putting the bishop on b4 here. And if a3, then d5 transposes to the line we just looked at, where black can profit by putting the knight on e4. So, see, what other ideas are there here? There's knight f3, simply blocking the diagonal to the weak g2 pawn. And then bishop to b4. Now this really does threaten, because of this pin, it really does threaten to capture on e4 because there are two pieces and only one white defender. So queen e2, the most natural way to defend e4, and then d5. So this is very similar to what we looked at, but with a couple extra moves in bishop b4 and queen e2. And after e5, there's knight e4. This is pinned, and if it capture, then black can capture back with a pawn, and the d4 pawn is can be attacked. And in general, this is probably going to lead to some exchanges in the center, and which would open up the long diagonal for the bishop on b7. So the main threat here is for black to take twice on c3. So I don't know, something like bishop d2 this probably is a line. And here black could just chop on d2 if he wants to, or it can chop on d3 and try and give white doubled c pawns. I don't know. It seems seems like a very comfortable position for black, because as opposed to the knight on d7, the knight on e4 is influencing white's strategy. So I don't know. I'm just going to play some moves here, like castle, takes on c3, and b takes c3, and I don't know. It could take on d2, could play c5. I kind of like the idea of playing c5 better because we might be, preparing to play c4. In some lines, we can, take on d4, which opens the c file. It's sort of like a 1 hour variation of the French defense. So that is a possible line if if white were to play knight f3. There's also knight ge2. This, sort of makes bishop b4 pointless, because after a3, bishop takes c3, the knight can recapture, and then there's still two defenders on e4. But after d5, white can play e5 here. Of course, if e takes d, then knight takes d, keeping the long diagonal open is again the right move. So e5, knight e4, and it's clear now that white's knights are messed up. He'd like to be able to drop this knight back to e2. And because there's no knight that can come to e3, in some lines, black can consider, introducing his queen into the action. Putting lateral pressure on white's center, and also, protecting e4. So this seems like a promising continuation on knight ge2. See what else. What else did I look at? There's queen e2, overprotecting the e pawn 3 times. But in trade-off, it leaves the d4 pawn weak. So knight c6, voluntarily blocking the diagonal of the bishop on b7, but hitting the d4 square. The most natural move to guard this is to bring the knight out to f3, and now knight b4, with the idea of taking on d3 and getting the bishop pair for black. The bishop pair, if black can take one of white's bishops and get the bishop pair, it's probably going to compensate him for for his space disadvantage, and black could claim some kind of dynamic equality, I suppose. Bishop c4 attempts to preserve the bishop, but then there's this super fork trick. Knight takes e4. And if knight takes e4, bishop takes e4, queen takes e4, d5 wins back the piece. I think the best line here is maybe to play check, forcing c6, and then to play queen e2. So again, black is forced to take. And then if queen takes b5, I think just queen d7, right? Looks reasonable. So because this the bishop guards the knight on b4. So I don't know, say we'll have c3 first. So this black does not want to play the knight back to a6, because then white would chop on b5 check and then take on a6. So the knight has to come back to c6 here, and then takes queen. Queen d7 is forced, otherwise there's knight e5. So queen d7, and then I don't know. This looks kind of equal. Is there? Yeah, Houdini is saying this is essentially equal in all lines. Cool. All right. What else? What else was there to look at? F3, I guess. F3, blocks the diagonal for the for black's bishop, by setting up all the white pawns on it. But if f3, then you'd think white would have played f3 earlier, because now this bishop d3 move doesn't make any sense. It's looking at the back of white's pawn chain, and also d4 is weak. So like in this position, if white wanted to try something with f3, probably this is the position to do it. And then this is a completely different variation of the Owens, where black is probably wants to play something like e6 and c5, or e6 and d5. Yeah. So f3. Oh yeah. Okay. c5, I guess, is the main black way to gain pressure against f3, because if white overprotects e4 too much in this opening, which is natural to do, then the d4 square can be attacked with moves like c5 and knight c6. Here c5 is the right way, because white takes, then this diagonal might be annoying for white to give up. And if I don't know, d5 I guess can't be played here because I don't know. Can d5 be played? Takes. And then if white takes, then black is just taking back. There's there's two attackers on d5. Is e5 anything here? I don't know. I didn't look at this, so. See, my first thought, after doing that Benko video on the 5f3 variation, my first thought is to play queen to e7 here. Queen e7. Again, you're looking at like live rambling or searching or whatever. I didn't look at this variation beforehand. The idea is to take on e5. The only way to defend, there are two ways to defend. One is to play queen e2, one is to play f4. If f4, well, this pawn is still pinned. There might be the threat of knight b5, coming into d6 for check. So there's is there d4 here? d4 hitting the knight with the idea of also hitting g2. Let's look at this. So the knight can't go to either of these squares because there's too much strength. So let's look at knight to b5, with the counter threat of check. But is this really anything like takes and check and king to e8? So here, black is going to, take an exchange on, or a whole rook. I mean, how does white, take back the bishop once it takes on h1? See, is there any kind of a counter threat here? Maybe bishop c4, with the, threat of taking on f7. So bishop c4. The threat is knight takes on f7 here. And I guess I don't know. Maybe just knight d5. I don't know. I think knight d5 here. And then what compensation does does white have for the rook that's dropping on h1? I'll just settle this by looking at Houdini here. Yep, it says that black is definitely better here. The best line being knight f3. So yeah. Sorry, I just went on a unplanned tangent there. Well, what about queen e2? This I think forces knight g8. And then what about knight b5? This I don't like because is knight c7 check and also knight d6. So maybe black has to play d4 here. d4 can be met by knight b5 as well. Yeah, I don't know, that might be trouble, actually. Like, oh, okay, yeah. And then he's saying, like, knight h5 with the idea of queen h4 check. This makes sense. Let's just go over the main line it's giving me here. Knight b5, queen h4, king f1, and then, I guess, knight c6. This looks crazy. Knight c7 check, king d8, knight takes a8, c4. Looks reasonably active for black. I mean, this bishop is coming to c5. Looking at these squares, this rook is coming to e8. Yeah, that's an interesting variation, actually. So yeah, f3, f3, c5, and then d5 is an interesting line. But after queen e7 and knight h5, this looks like black is doing well. Oh, yeah, I didn't prepare enough for this video and make any attempt to trim down my analysis here. So here, I think knight ge2 was the only move that I originally had entered, and then knight c6. And I mean, here, there's, if white were to do this, then you can probably just get a wholesale exchange of pieces, like bishop c5 here, yeah, a6 rather, with the idea of playing queen c7, bishop c5 with a Sicilian-like position. Another line I didn't look at beforehand. So here, I mean, that's why d5, I guess, would be the best try for white, and then knight e5 instead of taking. With a sample line being bishop f4, queen b8. This is a good move. It protects e5, protects the knight on e5, and it doesn't get in the way of black's other pieces. So after castles here, a6, threatening to expand with b5 and possibly c4. And if the pawn gets to c4, then this bishop can come to this diagonal. So white should probably prevent that by putting the pawn on a4, and then bishop e7, with the idea of bishop c4 castles, and this seems like a roughly even position. So yeah, this God, how long was that? Another video that was too long. So yeah, this has been some look at the the knight c3 e6 variations of the Owen's defense, which is the queenside fianchetto with a 1 b6, 2 bishop b7. And if you want to learn more about how to refute the bishop d3 and f5 line, then I can make another video on that, which is going to be what I had planned to do in the first place. Or you could just go to Wikipedia and read about it. Either way, have a good one, YouTube, and see you next time.